Is it on? Okay, cool. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. We're almost close to starting on time, which I respect and appreciate. If anybody needs coffee, there's coffee in the back and pastries from the Blue-Eyed Daisy here. I want to welcome Dr. Alice Rothchild to Serenbe. She's visiting us from Seattle, and I really appreciate you making the extra trip out of Atlanta, where all of your other events have been this week, to visit us. She's here as we continue to bear witness and make our voices heard on the horrific brutality directed at Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, which has taken more than 33,000 Palestinian lives in 6 months, 15,000 of them children. She brings a really unique perspective to the current events as a doctor of more than 40 years, an author, a filmmaker, and an activist for Palestinian rights and freedom. Also as a Jew who sits on the board of the Gaza Mental Health Foundation and member of the Health Advisory Council of Jewish Voice for Peace. She's worked extensively in both Israel and Palestine and was most recently in Gaza in August of 2023, just 2 months before the horrific attacks on October 7th. We've asked Dr. Rothchild to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end of her talk, so please hold your questions for then. Some things that I've asked her to cover are her journey growing up in a very traditional Zionist family and changing her mind on Palestine over time, why it's necessary to humanize Palestinians through stories, which is something that I think storytelling is such an important part about a struggle for freedom, and contrasting the daily life of Israelis and Palestinians, as she spent so much time in both countries and with both people. And then, of course, how we can move forward towards peace. I want to thank you all for coming. Most of us live here due to a conscious decision to change our lives for ourselves and for our families, and many of us are working towards better futures. I think we may have enough independent thinkers and social energy here to take on issues and form relationships beyond what's possible outside of Serenbe. I think we're in a really unique space in this community. I also want to thank John Niditz and Interfaith at Serenbe for sponsoring this event and helping us bring everyone together. John and I have become friends who do not agree on everything as it pertains to Israel and Palestine, but we share a desire to learn more ourselves and to have productive conversations together that are grounded in respect and a desire to learn. So my hope is that we come out of this conversation stronger as a community with greater empathy and understanding for one another and for Palestinians. Last, I want to thank Reverend Abu Akel. It's his birthday. He's turning 50 today. And Sarah Humphrey. Where's Sarah at? Oh, there. Sarah, thank you. Sarah is with Joining Hands for Justice for Palestine group. And she and Reverend Abu Akel helped us connect with Dr. Rothchild to bring her here today. So thank you guys. It wouldn't be possible without you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the doctor. Thank you.
Just let me hop over this. I will now fall on my face going over to the mic. Okay. This feels very TED Talky to sit like this. So thank you all for coming, and it's really thrilling to see this sort of magical place. It's very interesting, whoops, that no one is, except for you, sitting in the front row, but because I really am very friendly, you know. So as Stephanie mentioned, I'm going to try to answer the questions she posed, and then talk about some other stuff that I think is important. So where did I start? I had grandparents from Western Ukraine, from little shtetls in the Jewish communities there. And they came, and my parents were born, both of them in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg. And they, as young people often do, desperately wanted to get out of Brooklyn. And so after my father finished with World War II and with GI Bill and all that kind of stuff, my mother loved Thoreau. So they moved to New England and wanted to find a town with a pond, you know. And so I ended up growing up in a small town south of Boston with a pond. And this was sort of the immigrant assimilationist dream kind of world. Not quite as dreamy as this place, but we had a lot of land and birds and things like that. And we were upwardly mobile. It was a sort of moderately multicultural place. But I knew as a Jewish kid that we were different, that we were an endangered tribe. And I went to Hebrew school 3 days a week. I had a bat mitzvah. I saved lots of quarters in the Jewish National Fund blue and white boxes to buy forests of trees in Israel that I did not know were covering up destroyed Palestinian villages. And when I was 14, my family went to Israel for the sort of dream trip. And it was just a magical trip. And I know how I felt because I kept a diary that I still have. And besides my general awe about the place, I also noted that I had very racist attitudes towards Arabs. And I didn't know anything about the Palestinian word. That was not even in our consciousness. So as I continued to grow, in high school I was very much in love with Israeli dancing and with the kibbutz movement. This all seemed very idealistic. But I always knew that I was an outsider in a dominant Christian world. And I was probably a slightly weird kid, so in 6th grade we had to draw a picture of what we wanted. And kids wanted things, and I drew a picture of the globe and I wanted world peace. So already I was a little odd, I think. I also had a taste of anti-Semitism as a kid. When we moved to this town, there were about 4,000 people. And over the next 10 years, 10,000 people moved in, and they were all Jews. And they were all fleeing the sort of shtetls of Roxbury and Dorchester and Brooklyn, just trying to get out and be American. And so what happened was that in December, every class would get a Christmas tree, and we spent December decorating the tree, learning Christmas carols. And the Jewish parents were kind of pissed off about this. So there was a town meeting, and a whole bunch of townspeople marched on the meeting with big signs accusing the Jews of destroying Christmas. And this made national news. So this was kind of a shock to my system. And also, my mother was a writer, and she wrote about this mythical town, which she called Northrop, which was actually our town. So I got it all documented in her writing, so I know that I'm not imagining this stuff. I also had a youthful obsession with the Nazi Holocaust, again, because of my mother. She wrote about the Nazi Holocaust, and she wrote a very important book called Voices from the Holocaust. So I also became aware, because of her work working in inner city schools, that Jews were progressive people, that we supported the civil rights movement and labor and women's movement and those kind of things. That's the kind of people we are. But I also found out there's a limit to my mother's liberalism. So when I started college, I had an African-American boyfriend. He was no slouch. He was at Harvard. He was pre-med. He was a brilliant violinist, played with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. But she said that if I married him, Hitler's dream would come true, and that she would sit Shiva, cast me out of the family. And I don't know if she would actually done that, but that's quite a heavy message for a 19-year-old trying to figure out who she is and who she should love and all that stuff. So I went to college in the 60s, and I went to a very sort of waspy elite women's college. And Jews were pretty exotic there. And I actually had a young woman come up to me and say, "May I touch you? I've never met a Jew before." So again, not a member of the Christian world here. And at this college, the legacy girls all majored in art history and went to Italy for their junior year abroad, just like their grandmothers did, whereas my grandmothers were illiterate. And I came with a legacy, not of tea sets, which we were encouraged to bring. My grandmother didn't bequeath me a tea set. I don't think she actually drank tea. But I came with a legacy of Holocaust memory, trauma, our tribalism as Jews, our attempts to assimilate, and our pride in our ability to survive and flourish in what I perceive to be a sort of hostile anti-Semitic world. And years later, I was giving a talk at a temple, and I was talking about how the victors write the history. And this older gentleman got up and said, "We are not the victors. We lost 6 million times." So I really was struggling with how do we as Jews live with the Holocaust, but not in the Holocaust, which is a major struggle for the Jewish community. So as I matured, I really came away with this idea that we are all victims, that we are all survivors as Jews, and also that a threat of another Holocaust lurked everywhere. So it makes you a little paranoid as you grow up. So we were chosen people. We were chosen not only to be persecuted, but my mother used to explain, we're chosen because we're chosen to make the world a better place. My mother's beliefs about Israel were very clear. She was a very ardent believer in the wonderfulness of Israel. And she taught me that the Jewish pioneers bought the land, and then after the Holocaust, she felt that, Jews are inherently good people. That's who we are. And we do not steal, we do not massacre, we do not rape, we do not take what's not rightfully ours. And we also do not share our victimhood. So in college, my Jewish identity persevered. I had a Jewish discussion group with another men's college around the corner, went to occasional holidays, but I mostly started learning about, well, I was pre-med, so I was trying to survive, physics and chemistry and not paying attention to my cultural identity. But I got involved in, opposing the Vietnam War, and then when I went to medical school, which was an incredibly sexist environment at that point, becoming an ardent feminist and learning about healthcare reform. So I became a much more political person and developed a much more political understanding about how the world works. So in terms of medicine, I then did an internship at Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx, which is one of the poorest places in this country. So I got to experience the two-class healthcare system and how I learned a tremendous amount from people who were very poor and very beaten down by the system. And also, then I trained at Beth Israel Hospital, which was founded in the 1920s because Jews could not get admitting privileges in Boston at Brigham and Women and the Deaconess and the sort of major Harvard hospitals. And this was a much wider, more diverse population. And gradually through the years, I realized that I had never actually met an Arab in my life, and that I had been taught a very one-sided, Jewish-centric version of history of Israel. And it was a lot like the version of history I learned about the United States. Columbus discovered America, and he may have even been Jewish. He maybe was a Marrano. And then the Pilgrims came, and they all ate turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce with the Indians, and everybody was fine. So, in my U.S. education, there was no Trail of Tears, there was no genocide, and we skipped over all of that stuff. And it was similar to my education about Israel. So you asked me, what was the process for change? And I think that, between doing my work as an obstetrician gynecologist and having 2 kids and, all that kind of stuff, I started reading about colonialism and imperialism and Middle East history. And I developed a much more increasing awareness of how the world works and what are the forces behind what we see. And I also became increasingly uncomfortable with the version of history that I learned in Hebrew school. And after the Israeli occupation, I was in '67, I also started thinking about occupation, although it was still kind of a vague concept. And like many Jewish communities, if I tried to talk about it, everybody started yelling at each other. So there was a real reason never, ever to bring it up. So this persisted as I tried to, work 60 hours a week and do my stuff. But it was like nagging at me that I have to figure this out. So in the late 1990s, with a similar group of agonized progressive Jews, I was part of a group called Workmen's Circle. It's now called Workers' Circle. And this was a secular Jewish cultural group. We had our kids in the Sunday school. And we also got together with a group from New Jewish Agenda, which were sort of lefty Jews at the time, and a chavura named Kahil Berah. And we realized what we need to do is to start a dialogue group. So we did that. And we started inviting all the local Palestinians in Boston to come tell us their story. And also we invited lefty Jews, Israelis, to come and tell their story. So we had a very intense, rapid education about all the history that we didn't know in a very personal way. And from that, I was involved in co-organizing a health and human rights delegation. So starting in 2003, we started taking people to the region doing health and human rights work. And I did that for years and then went on a lot of other similar focused delegations. So I've been to the region almost annually except for COVID since 2004. And what I found, what our goal was, is that a lot of people get so freaked out about talking about Israel that maybe we could say, let's talk about what happens to women who are pregnant. Everybody, whether you're a Zionist or non-Zionist, knows that women should not deliver at checkpoints. So why are women delivering at checkpoints? And then you go from there, well, why is there a checkpoint? And then you can talk about occupation. So I gradually began to make invisible people in my life visible, and also to confront the kind of fear and trauma that I grew up with. And the interesting thing for me is that the more Palestinians I met, the more I realized that we had a very common language. We had trauma, we had denial, despair, endurance, recovery. These people felt like cousins to me and not like enemies. And then I started reading what are called the new Israeli historians, which are in your lending library. So what happened was that the Israeli government opened up the archives in the 80s, and so all these histories were written about what actually happened based on the archives. And I also started reading Palestinian historians and academics. So this led me to really revisit what happened in 1948. What is the Nakba? 750,000 people displaced. What's that about? And what happened in '67? And I also, at this point, began to understand that the Israel that I knew, the ingathering of the exiles, the light unto the nations, was actually more of a racist settler colonial state. And I had to grapple with that. And I began to understand the difference between anti-Semitism, which is hating Jews, Jewish institutions, anything Jewish just because they're Jewish, with criticizing Israel, which is a state and not a religion, with Zionism, which is a political ideology that privileges Jews over the native population in historic Palestine. And I found that if I could sort those things out into their different categories, I could have a much more intelligent conversation about what is going on. But these are often kind of all mashed together, and it makes it very hard to think about clearly. I also came to understand that much of the discord in this region can be traced to the consequences of the post-world wars, when imperial powers basically divided up the Middle East the way they thought it should be, not asking the native populations how they felt, and empowering minority groups to govern over majority groups, creating long-standing enmities, and funding oppressive dictators and proxy wars, and all of that kind of meddling has produced what we have now. So I felt my responsibility as a Jewish person, faced with a state that keeps saying it speaks for the Jews, and I'm like, not this Jew, it's my responsibility to do something about that. And also, I'm a US citizen, so I'm partially responsible for the $3.8 billion that we send to Israel every year. So all of these things made me want to work on this particular issue. So over the decades, I started asking really serious questions. What kind of country is Israel? What is going on in terms of the Nakba? And I got to understand that the Nakba isn't something that just happened in 1947-48. The Nakba is ongoing, and what's going on in Gaza is exactly an example of that particular problem. And I also saw all the decades of peace processes were mostly processes and had nothing to do with peace. And I was very much in favor of dialogue and coexistence. That was how I first got into this, and that's really important. But it became increasingly clear to me that dialogue and coexistence doesn't mean much if it doesn't create political change. So I'll tell you a story. I had a dear friend who became a physician, but I met her when she was in college. She grew up in East Jerusalem, and her family sent her to the Seeds of Peace camp in Maine when she was 14. So every year she went to this camp. She got to know Jewish Israelis. They wrote plays, they played soccer, they did all the things that teenagers do. But then when the Jewish kids turned 18, they all joined the military, and they became the soldiers that were at checkpoints stopping her from being able to go from point A to point B. So again, even though she knew them as human beings, if the political situation didn't change, it wasn't much use to her. And so gradually I realized that part of my job was to support Palestinian resistance, which is almost entirely nonviolent, and to support the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, which was called in 2005. And we know that the Israeli government will not give up power, will not change its policies of aggression and suppression of Palestinians voluntarily, because no governments do that. That's not how countries behave. That's not how the powerful behaves. So it's really important to have international pressure to create change. And also the behavior of the Israeli government is very provocative for its Arab neighbors. I mean, look what's going on, for instance, with Iran, which is not Jordan or Syria or Lebanon. They're all being sort of riled up by the behavior of the Israeli government. And those governments have also repeatedly failed the Palestinians. There also, I became much more aware of what we call intersectional issues. I mean, first of all, think of what we could do with $3.8 billion in this country. I could have a very long list, and I'm sure you could too. But let's take police brutality. I became aware that a lot of our police are trained in Israel. So they are trained to be a colonizing, occupying, militarized force. And then they come back to our cities and they behave that way towards our people. And that is really not okay. Or if you look at the whole military-industrial complex, this is a huge industry that is partly in the US and partly in Israel. So, you know, with this horrific war, there are a lot of companies that are making a lot of money. And when they talk about their weapons being field tested, which is a big thing that the Israeli companies do, they're field tested on Palestinians. And so Palestinians are always trying to figure out, well, which new weapon is this and which new, tear gas is this? And then we look at issues around surveillance and racism and threats to civil liberties. And there's a huge amount of connection between our country and Israel. So I got to understand that the ideology of Zionism privileges Jews and requires harm to Palestinians, and that Zionism believes that Jewish safety is predicated on oppressing Palestinians in a variety of ways. And I really felt like I couldn't be part of that. And so I became an anti-Zionist Jew. And I also would like to say that this reality is deeply corruptive to Jewish Israelis. I mean, you just have to think about an 18-year-old soldier who has gone through the Israeli educational system, been taught that he's never really had a relationship with an Arab, has taught that the Arabs, because they don't call them Palestinians, just want to kill them and hate them and all that kind of stuff. And then he's at a checkpoint with a massive amount of gunpowder and military stuff on his body, and he has absolute control over civilian population trying to get to school or to visit their grandmother or to get to the hospital. And then this kid, after having this fairly boring but powerful job, comes home. And he's got his big gun, and there's a rise in gender-based violence, and it has an impact on Israeli society. And it's also corruptive to Jews internationally who support Israel uncritically, because we are being asked to support a state whose behaviors are really not defensible. And I see this a lot with young Jews in America who say to me, Zionism is destroying my Judaism. And we don't want that to happen. There's a lot of beauty in Judaism, and we don't want it to be destroyed. But we see that younger Jews and some, old people like me are not willing to give up our love of justice and democracy and tolerance and fighting for the oppressed when it comes to Israel-Palestine. We also see the growth of very right-wing forces, both in Israel and the US, and it's very McCarthy-esque, that are very aggressive at muzzling and punishing dissent. And actually, this is very un-Talmudic. We're the people who are supposed to ask a million questions, 10 Jews, 20 answers kind of thing. So this is really a trend in the wrong direction. So it looks to me that Jewish power in the 21st century is really all about power and nothing about being Jewish. And you have to ask, why do Israelis love Trump? Why are Israelis in bed with Christian Zionists who are really planning for them to die when the apocalypse comes? And it's not just the leadership. I mean, I hear a lot of people say, we just got to get rid of Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. These guys are horrendous. But there was a recent poll that showed that 2/3 of the Jewish Israeli public would not support a two-state solution or even giving basic human rights and to Palestinians and never recognizing their right to self-determination. So when you put all the blame on the prime ministers and the government, you're really missing the point. And the point is that Jewish Israelis have long advanced, enabled, and come to terms with their country's system of military occupation and dehumanization of Palestinians. So when I committed myself to doing Palestinian solidarity work, needless to say, I met the pushback. And so I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what that's like. So, I was an obstetrician gynecologist in Beth Israel Hospital, so you can imagine the tone in that hospital towards Israel. And I was talking with my chief, and you really need your chief to be on your side, because I was going to Israel, and I wanted to meet Jewish Israeli doctors and hear what their lives were like, and I was trying to understand the whole thing. And he refused to tell me any names of his colleagues, because he was a big Zionist, and he took people over there all the time. And finally he said to me, no, you are a danger to the Jewish people, which I hadn't actually realized at the time, but was a really completely inappropriate thing for him to say. And I've talked at a lot of colleges, and I have Jewish students come up to me and say, having you on my campus makes me feel unsafe. And they are confusing being unsafe, which they are not, I'm a total pacifist here, with being challenged. And Jewish students are very freaked out when they get challenged and they feel that somehow it's dangerous to them as a human being. So, I've had my share of being called a self-hating Jew and a capo and all those kinds of things. And I've actually had colleges where alumni have withdrawn their support when I've been invited to talk. I mean, it's really phenomenal how this all works out. And I often get accused of being imbalanced. And I want to just reflect a moment on that. And I want you to ask you how many history books, movies, novels, stories about Israel have been made that never mention Palestinians. And nobody accuses those people of being unbalanced. So you're only accused of being unbalanced when you're challenging the dominant narrative. And the dominant narrative is that Palestinians are invisible as human beings. So imbalance is only brought up when people don't like the message. So what I see now is that diaspora Jews, like me, are beginning to reclaim our legitimacy as Jews, because for years we were told we weren't real Jews because we weren't living in Israel. And that the treatment of and solidarity with Palestinians is really our civil rights movement, civil rights issue of the day. And so I do believe that how we Jews as a community in the diaspora handle our new positions of power and privilege, which we have, this will be critical to the survival of an ethical Jewish tradition and to a just solution to the century-old struggle in historic Palestine. So what I've had to do, being sort of cast out of my old community, is to create a chosen community. And my chosen community is other activist Jews that are willing to really struggle and wrestle with these issues, as well as Christians that are not Christian Zionists, African Americans who clearly recognize racism when they see it. And then I have a huge number of Muslim friends and colleagues who I would never have had if I'd stayed in my tribe. And then I have a community of health workers who work there. And I'm also involved with a program called We Are Not Numbers, which is a program that mentors young Gazans to improve their English writing skills and to be able to write their stories. And so I get sent the essays that these writers produce, which are all in fairly garbled English, and then we help people to get good English and to be professional writers. And a lot of them are now being questioned by mainstream media. So this is a way to have a constant connection with these young people, but also to really know what's happening. And I was asked about the issue of humanizing Palestinians. So I'm going to tell you a story. I made I'm an accidental filmmaker. We can talk about that later. But I made a documentary film where I told the history of Palestine through the voices of Palestinians that I interviewed. So instead of saying, in 1948, blah, 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 I had a guy who was 10 years old in 1948, and he talked about what it was like for him. And I wove all these stories together with me popping in and out going, hi, everybody here, I'm a nice Jewish girl, keep following me on my journey. And so it's a sort of intro movie into Palestinian history. And as I was developing this, I was very aware that I have to be very conscious of not talking for Palestinians and of getting the story right. So I was showing the pre-finished copy to a lot of different Palestinians, and I showed it to this Palestinian professor, and she got furious with me. I was like, ah! And she said, I don't need you to tell people that I'm a human being. And I said to her, well, you know you're a human being, but I live in a culture where people don't. And so Palestinians are constantly being forced to defend their humanity, and they're very much subject to racist stereotypes. So I felt like part of my job was to uplift the voices of Palestinians. So I started writing, and I can talk to you about how that happened, but it happened. And so with my first book, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, I first talked about my Jewish journey, because I want people to walk with me through this. But then all the other chapters about the Jewish Israelis and the Palestinians who taught me what I know, and I gave voice to these, I gave a platform to these folks. And then my next book, which is On the Brink, Israel and Palestine on the Eve of the 2014 War, is a collection of blogging that I did because I happened to be in the region right before the 2014 war, which is a horrific assault. And I could see that the Israelis were making a war happen. They would poke here, so many people would get killed, they would do this, they would close off this part of the West Bank. They were stirring things up until something would happen and there would be a response from Hamas. And so I was like, people, look at what's going on. And then a publisher said, this should be published. So again, giving a platform to these voices. And then I did my oral history documentary film. And then I wrote a book called Condition Critical, Life and Death in Israel-Palestine, which again was a collection of blogging on the ground and then the analysis, intellectual analysis about what these different chapters were about. And as I did this work, I got more and more aware that there's almost no quality literature for kids on Palestine. And I actually was asked by a Quaker teacher to write a book on Palestine. And I said, I don't write books for kids, just go away. And that night I dreamt a picture book and I was like, uh-oh, now I have to write a book on Palestine. So this led me on a whole journey to learn how to write children's books, which resulted in a middle grade novel called Old Enough to Know, and we have a couple of copies here if you want to buy them, which is about a Palestinian-American boy and his grandmother who's from the Ida refugee camp. And he's 9 years old, his sister's 16, wearing a hijab in a school, getting harassed. And the grandmother decides it's time for them to hear her story. And so I created a grandmother from all the grandmothers that I've interviewed. And she has these flashbacks, and she tells them her story through these flashbacks. So it's a way for a kid to learn the history without even knowing that that's what they're doing. And then I also wrote a young adult novel, which is what I call a stealth Palestine book, because it's called Finding Melody Sullivan. No way you would know that Melody Sullivan ends up in Hebron in the West Bank. But again, I'm trying to engage teens with these 3 teenagers, and they represent different voices in this particular conflict. And a lot of it takes place in Hebron and in occupied territory. So it's another attempt to get these issues and to get these experiences into the public eye. And then I also was got invited to write in a lot of anthologies, again, trying to uplift the sound of these voices. And I also have, when you do this work, you get lots of connections with people who are doing this work, Israelis, Palestinians, other activists, and I really treasure these relationships. And when I was in the region, I would, when I was doing clinical medicine, I would actually work in clinics and fill in for doctors that were not able to get there, or Physicians for Human Rights has a Saturday mobile clinic. So I'd also work in solidarity with other health professionals. And that was another way to get the experiences, to get to know these people, and then to talk about it and to spread the word. Now, one of your questions was contrasting life for Israelis and Palestinians through the lens of medical care. So I think, first of all, that question always bothers me because 20% of Israelis are Palestinian. And when we say Israeli, we just mean Jewish Israeli, but we don't clarify our language. So our language corrupts our ability to think about what's the reality on the ground. So early on in my organizing delegations, I visited with Israeli doctors and hospitals, despite the fact that my chief wouldn't give me any names. And I really got to witness their first world healthcare system. And they have universal access. There's actually a disproportionate number of health workers in the Israeli system who are Palestinian. There are a lot of Palestinian doctors and nurses. And, there is, institutional racism and personal racism and all those kind of issues that countries have. But, like I saw Jewish women who refused to have a roommate who was a Palestinian woman, that kind of thing postpartum. But, they have first world health care. And this was particularly clear during the COVID pandemic, because I did a weekly summary of health and human rights issues in Israel and Palestine around COVID. And, what happened in Israel was a totally different world than what happened in the occupied territories. Now, if you're an Israeli citizen, Jewish or Palestinian, you have access to these incredible hospitals. You have 5 HMOs, you have private care. There's a lot of very high-level hospitals. And then, a mile or two away, it's a whole nother world. So in the West Bank, there are some higher-level, tertiary care level hospitals in East Jerusalem, which the Israelis think are part of Jerusalem. And so you'll hear about Augusta Victoria or Makasset Hospital or St. Jude's High Hospital. There's a whole bunch of them. I mean, they're not as high level as the Israeli hospitals because they're not as well funded. And so they suffer from being under occupation. But if you go into the West Bank or Gaza, then the system is run by the Ministry of Health, which has set up a whole hospital system. This happened after the Oslo Accords. There's a healthcare system that's run by what's called UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is for the people who became refugees after 48 and 67. And then they have some private doctors. And all of these systems are chronically underfunded. They lack equipment and medicine. And this is because the Israeli government has an active program of what's called de-development, which means, particularly in Gaza, they restrict what can get into that part of the world. So you can't get a CT scan and you can't get essential medications. You can't get equipment in. Your doctors can't get out to get high-level training. So their care, although the doctors are heroic and they make do with very little, is of a lower quality than you get in Israel. And I think, I was once at a hospital in Hebron and they had a CT scan, but it didn't work because there was a part that was missing, and the part had been sitting at a checkpoint for months, and the Israelis just weren't letting the part in. So even the equipment was under occupation. Or, people who need high-level care, who, let's say, are living in Gaza, have to go through a very bureaucratic request for permits, a medical permit, and that's a whole nightmare in itself. So you're dying of cancer, you're trying to get a permit, you wait, finally it comes through, or not, and then they give you it late and you miss your appointment. You see this kind of thing over and over again. And in the West Bank, there are 2 medical schools, there are professional schools, people are very highly trained. And in Gaza, there were medical schools and everything has just been smashed to bits. And a lot of the problem in Gaza is that they train a large number of medical professionals, but there are no paying jobs for them. And we see lots of people who are highly trained who just aren't working because there's no jobs. And it's not that they're not needed, it's that the institutions are not working well enough and funded well enough and equipped well enough. And now they just don't exist anymore. And so if you look at what's happening today in Gaza, there are 9 partially working hospitals, and partially is like really partially, out of 36 hospitals, and the rest have been utterly destroyed. 2/3 of the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency clinics, have been destroyed. I did a piece for the New York Times on pregnancy, and most pregnant women are receiving no prenatal care. Most of them are internally displaced. 75% of the population is internally displaced. We're talking about 50 to 60,000 women, and most of them have no idea where they're going to deliver. So that means that you go into labor, you could risk your life trying to get to a hospital, and there may or may not be a place for you when you get there. And there are reports of women undergoing C-sections without anesthesia because they have no pain medicine. But a lot of women are delivering in tents, in shelters, with no medical care. So we're going to see extreme increases in maternal death and infant death. And one of the issues about infant death is that the babies that die in the tent are not registered. So we're not even going to know that these babies died. And you got to think about all the other people, the people with heart disease or hypertension or schizophrenia. They're not getting their medications. They're not getting their health care. So it's really catastrophic in Gaza. And at this point, you mentioned the deaths. There are almost 34,000 people who have died, and 14,500 are children. Around 9,500 are women. These people are by definition not terrorists. These are innocent people. And a lot of the men are also innocent. And there's about 77,000 injured, and a lot of them are amputees because of the bombing. And it's currently estimated that every hour, 10 children lose 1 or 2 limbs. And there's not a medical system that can help them. And the Israelis bombed the only center that makes artificial limbs, for instance. And a child that has their limbs blown off is going to need multiple surgeries and multiple different limbs as they grow, and it's just not there. There's also been a massive attack on aid workers. It's estimated that there are 225 aid workers who were killed. And this is the largest number of UN personnel killed in a conflict in the history of the world. And there are almost 500 health workers who have been killed. And even if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, there have been some groups like the London School of, it's a very colonial name, Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, along with Johns Hopkins, did predictions on how many people are going to die if there's a ceasefire, if there isn't a ceasefire, blah, 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 if there's an epidemic, if there isn't an epidemic. And we're talking about numbers like 85,000 to 100,000 people dying in the next 6 months. And they're mostly dying of infection because there's no antibiotics and there are all these injured people. So from a medical standpoint, this is just beyond catastrophe. And what we look at this and we call it medical apartheid. There are two separate systems for two separate peoples, and their outcomes are very, very different. Now, I was asked to think about moving towards peace, which is a tough question, because I don't think that we can talk about peace under the current conditions. If you look at Israel, Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, all their racist buddies are really fascistic people. The language coming out of the Israeli government is just spine-chilling. They're talking about Palestinians as animals, talking about having another Nakba. So there is really no one in Israel that's in a position of power to make peace with. And they're all very clearly stating they're against a two-state solution, and they're really against treating Palestinians as fellow human beings. And the Israeli public, which is very diverse and divided, has been shifting to the right over the years. And right now there are people demonstrating against Netanyahu because they want their hostages back, which they should have them back. And they know that the only time hostages have been released is when there's been a ceasefire. But these folks are never demonstrating against the occupation. That's not even in their radar. So Israelis as a group, and I'm making generalizations, but as a group, it's a population that's very hurt, that's very angry, that's very revengeful. And they've also been humiliated because they thought their military could protect them and their military failed them. And so they've been fed this picture of Gazans as these sort of bloodthirsty, hypersexualized terrorists. So Gazans have been utterly dehumanized in Israeli eyes. So again, this population is not about to make any peace. And for Israelis, I often find that they think that this started October 7th. And they have no context that there's been a 16-year siege, a 57-year occupation, and that there are huge numbers of Palestinians, rotting in Israeli prisons in really awful situations. There's a thing called administrative detention, where if you get arrested in the territories, you can get put in administrative detention where you don't have any charges, and you just wait, and you can wait a week or a month or a year, and they just keep renewing the detention. And there's like thousands and thousands of Palestinians in that situation. And so there's no context for Israelis, and they don't understand that Israel cannot oppress millions of people and think that they're not going to resist. Oppressed people do resist. You may not like their resistance, but they are going to resist, whether they're Palestinians, whether they're Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, whether they're slaves in Georgia. That's what oppressed people do. And the other problem is that the Palestinian Authority was set up after Oslo, to run the government and to have a system in the occupied territories. But what has happened over the years is it's basically become a collaborator with the Israeli military. The Palestinian Authority spends more on security, and basically security for the Jewish settlements, than they spend on education and health care. And so the Palestinian Authority is very much disliked in the West Bank. And they're also pretty corrupt, and there's a lot of cronyism in the leadership. The people on the ground working in the hospitals and health centers and all that kind of stuff are fabulous. But as you move up the chain of power and command, it's not a very functional organization. And there's also a huge number of potential Palestinian leaders who are currently in Israeli jails. And you should know that since October 7th in the West Bank has been under total closure. There have been massive numbers of arrests. None of the Palestinian workers, there were thousands of Palestinian workers that had jobs in Israel, are allowed to come into Israel, so there's rising levels of poverty. And there's been over 450 Palestinians killed in the West Bank. And the UN has documented over 700 Jewish settler attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So the other thing the Israeli forces have keep doing is assaulting Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is like poking Palestinian Muslims in the eye. It's like if you want to make people angry, you go and do something terrible on Al-Aqsa. And they keep doing it, and they're going to make more and more people angry and not interested in having a peaceful moment. If we look at Hamas, it's a complicated organization. It started in 1987 in response to the First Intifada. And it started as an organization to help people be better Muslims and also to oppose the Israeli occupation. And it's not a monolithic organization. It has a huge social service side. It's built orphanages and hospitals and a lot of things that take care of people. It has a much more militant wing. And over the years, the Israelis have assassinated most of the moderate leadership because they needed an enemy to have in their politics. But they've also have a huge amount of admiration from Palestinians because they've actually hurt Israelis and made a real push for people to notice what's happening in Gaza. But also they're responsible for not ever being able to make peace with Israelis and also the Israeli response, which has been horrific for Gazans. So people have a very mixed opinion of Hamas, but ultimately Hamas is not going to be destroyed by destroying the entire infrastructure of Gaza because it's a movement, a liberation movement. And so that's another problem in trying to think about how we're going to have peace. So if we're going to break out of this pattern, first of all, we need to have a ceasefire. We need to stop killing Gazans and destroying the whole infrastructure. And there's immense need for massive humanitarian aid. I mean, I don't know if you're reading stuff, but there is now starvation happening in northern Gaza. And the average caloric intake now in northern Gaza is about 255 calories a day since January. I mean, I have a friend who just got out who's a prominent doctor, who was a skinny guy to begin with, and he had lost 30 pounds in 6 months. And then there has to be a total reconstruction of Gaza. And who's going to pay for that? It's billions and billions of dollars. The environment is totally contaminated. There's a lot of work to be done. But we also need to stop the settler movement grabbing all the land in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so this is not going to happen internally in Israel. This is something that the international community has to take responsibility for and to hold Israel and the US accountable because we make this possible. And I would say that we need to start thinking about decolonizing our solutions. You can't tell Gazans that we're going to make the Palestinian Authority be in charge of you now. That's not going to work. And what has to happen is that the occupation has to end. And this can't be superimposed by Western powers and Israel. And also we need to examine the issue of the attempts to destroy UNRWA because there is a big attempt to destroy UNRWA. And this has been a long-standing project of the Israeli government because UNRWA reminds people that there is a refugee population and the Israeli government doesn't want people to think about these refugees and they want them to lose their rights and their ability to survive. So the question is, how can we as US citizens help? I think the first thing is to get educated and then to educate your friends and your community. And then we need to be protesting and we need to be bringing this message to the world and to our elected officials because it's our Congress who makes this all possible. And so this is a time when you should be calling your congresspeople and your elected officials and making a fuss, every day for 10 minutes, just do it. And I think that there is a growing awareness in our Congress, but there's miles to go. I think this is a time to seriously support the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, the nonviolent resistance movement that Palestinians have, and to donate to aid groups. And it does seem pretty hopeless, but I have a friend who runs a art and cultural group for kids in Bethlehem in the Ida refugee camp, and he always says, I don't have the luxury for despair. And I take his mantra as my mantra. And the last thing I'm going to talk about that you didn't ask me about is I want to look at how we learn about Palestine and how our kids learn about Palestine. And I'm sure you're all aware that there's a massive attack in the academic world and in the academy against professors who teach Palestine, who question Israeli policy. I mean, professors are losing their jobs, they're being doxxed, they're being reprimanded. All sorts of awful things are happening at that level. But since, and this also happens to Palestinian activists and Jewish activists, but Palestinians are the preferred people in this attack. But now this is going down into K through 12. And I became very aware of this, having written 2 books for kids. So I was involved with the Palestine Literature Rights Festival. It's a Palestine Rights Literature Festival last September. I don't know if you've heard about this, but it was this amazing celebration of Palestinian culture, Palestinian writers, and writers on Palestine. And the University of Pennsylvania sponsored this. And before it even started, there was a massive pushback from right-wing groups. The university, in the name of free speech, allowed this to happen, although they said, we don't agree with these people, but we're going to allow them to happen, And so we had this convention, and it was just one of the most joyous experiences I've ever had in my life, and it was very powerful. And after that, there were a huge number of more pushback lawsuits, and ultimately the president of UPenn was forced to resign, and this was one of the reasons. So just to give you a sense of the pushback. So in the face of all of this, Nora Lester-Murad, who's another Jewish person who does this kind of work and has written a young adult book, and I decided to develop a toolkit for teachers who try to teach Palestine in K through 12. And so we interviewed many, many teachers and librarians, documented their experiences, and then developed strategies for teachers preparing to teach, and then resources for them, and then what is available in the community to defend them once they get attacked, doxxed, whatever. And now this toolkit rolled out last week. It's available on her website and on my website, and now on Palestine Legal and a whole bunch of other websites. But it is a good source of information for teachers who want to tiptoe into this world, because it is a very complicated world because of all the pushback. And I think we have to remember that in this country, the idea that Palestinians are anti-Semitic and hate Jews is deeply entrenched and is very racist and is really unrelated to reality. And it really makes it difficult for teachers and academics to have these conversations. And I think, labeling criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic basically turns Palestinians and their life stories about being victimized into hate speech, which is crazy. And that's part of the problem that's going on in this country. And suggesting that talking about Palestinians is dangerous to Jews, Jews can't benefit from the oppression of other people. That's not a way to frame liberation struggles. And claiming that support of Israel is a core description of a Jewish person ignores the diversity within the Jewish community. So there are all sorts of really important issues that get touched upon that we talk about in this toolkit. And ultimately what we see is that the accusation of anti-Semitism has been weaponized. And it's weaponized to shut people up, to shut academics up, to shut up activists. And it's very, very dangerous because there is actual anti-Semitism in this country, and it's different than criticizing Israel. So we really need to tease out all of those things and to be able to think very clearly about these issues if we're going to teach a whole young generation of kids and have books on Palestine and books by Palestinians available in our schools. Because right now it's like they're banned before they're even written. And once you write one, it's very hard to get it out there. And so that's another whole project that we need to be working on and to fight against this kind of self-censorship, because teachers are afraid, and we need to help empower them to be less afraid. So I'm going to stop talking now and open this up to a Q&A. And I welcome your comments, and I just want you to know that I share, not to convince you, but for you to just honor what my experiences have been. And I hope we can, have that conversation in that style of collegiality. So just why don't you raise your hand and we'll have the microphone, or how do we do this so that it gets recorded on Zoom?
Would you just repeat the question?
Oh, I'll repeat the question. Great idea. Okay, so yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your words. Lots to think about. I'm interested in why perhaps a nonviolent movement in Palestine hasn't worked. Like, Gandhi was so successful, Martin Luther King was so successful. Why has that not worked? And I mean, is there a cultural reason, a religious reason perhaps that it hasn't worked? Because it seems like it's an ideal, and Israelis would respond to that.
Right. So the question is, why has a nonviolent movement not worked in Palestine? So it's interesting to me because when I look at Palestinian resistance, I see all different levels of resistance. At the most basic level, Palestinians say we resist to exist. So just the fact that people are refusing to leave their land, are getting up in the morning, getting their 5 kids dressed, taking them through the checkpoints to school, getting to work, not losing it in front of an Israeli soldier, coming home, not having adequate supplies of whatever they need. That is a form of daily resistance for Palestinians. And that is a nonviolent kind of resistance. You also see a huge amount of cultural resistance. There are Palestinian artists, there are Palestinian poets, there are Palestinian novelists, there's Palestinian music. There is a whole cultural resistance that occurs in Palestine. So I would disagree with the idea that nonviolent resistance hasn't worked. Palestinians have a long history of, refusing to pay taxes, for instance. Or if you look at the Great March of Return, thousands and thousands of Palestinians every week march to the borders of Gaza. And they almost all of them were nonviolent. And they had weddings there, they had celebrations there, they had chants there. And they were met by Israeli snipers shooting them in the legs. There was a policy of shooting them in the legs, creating an enormous amount of orthopedic injuries. So for me, the question is, why is the perception that the Palestinians are violent and the Israelis are not? Because the level of violence that Palestinians face on a day-to-day basis is so extraordinarily high that I think it's a miracle that they have been as nonviolent as they have been. And so part of what I'm hearing from you is the idea that Palestinians are violent and the culture is violent, when that's part of the propaganda. And it's not really what you see when you go there. And it's so interesting, because when I started doing this work, I had Israeli friends say, do you go with a soldier and a gun, and you got to protect yourself against these people? And I was like, actually, I feel very safe there. And actually, the people that really scare me are the 18-year-olds at the checkpoints that I stand in, and I don't know what they're going to do, because they do really violent things to people. And I'm standing in a crowd of 100 people who've just waited for 3 hours for this kid to open up the checkpoint, and none of us have guns, and he's the one with the gun. So it's so interesting to me that the perception is that Palestinians are somehow inherently violent. And that's partly the racist propaganda that we have, and also what makes the headlines. It bleeds, it leads kind of thing. So if there's a Palestinian who does something violent, which Palestinians do, we hear about it. If 100,000 people get up in the morning and don't lose it at a checkpoint, we don't hear about it. But those people are practicing nonviolent resistance. So I would sort of reframe how I think about that based on my personal experience and my experience of Palestinians. And the thing that is really an example of that is that in 2005, there was a call for boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. And the Israelis responded to this with total craziness, is what I have to say. They were completely opposed to this, and they said, this is a terrible thing, and we must oppose this. And Netanyahu actually said that the boycott, divestment, sanction movement was second only to Iran in terms of its threat to Israel. So here we have a totally nonviolent resistance movement that was inspired by South African resistance, that is advocating an opposition to an oppressive regime non-violently, and it was met with total condemnation by Israel and by much of the Jewish community. So Palestinians get condemned when they do nonviolent resistance in an organized fashion. And then, if they do violent resistance, they get condemned. So they get condemned coming and going. So how is a person who's living in a situation that is really unfair, untenable, unjust, how are they supposed to change that if either form of resistance is met with condemnation? So I think we have to look at the kinds of assumptions we have and to be more clear-eyed about what the facts are on the ground, and also what our prejudices are, because we all have them, And there's a huge amount of racism towards Arab people, and we carry that in us because we live in that kind of culture. So we have to unpack what we bring to the conversation. And it's hard work. It's really hard work. But one of the ways to undo it is to actually meet Palestinians, read their literature, read their poetry, to really understand the culture better. And they're just horrific tragedies. I mean, the Israeli military has gone after, has targeted a lot of Palestinian academics in Gaza and killed people who were enormously prominent, peacekeeping, intelligent, visionary people, and they're dead. That's violence. What that professor was doing is not violence. But you see this over and over again. So that would be how I would look at that question. Yeah. Yes.
So just in the tradition of arguing more on
Go
the
for
same
it.
point.
Yes.
Look back at 1947, and you have, an armed revolt by the Muslims against the British, understandably and successful for a while, and then armed fighting between the Israeli,
It wasn't Israel yet, yeah.
the Jewish militants, blowing up the King David Hotel,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. And so you have this tremendous history of violence. At the same time in India, you have the nonviolent movement leading to independence. And so, the vision that I heard from my wife Ann, by the way, introducing you, is that, isn't it just tragic that this whole world was created through this crucible of violence instead of the way, and not that India and Pakistan haven't had their own.
Yeah, let's be real here,
But I'm just saying,
Yeah.
if one avenue go forward might be leadership from someone who invokes Gandhi and King, who better to do that than a leader of the Palestinians?
So, first of all, I agree with the last thing, and I also say that there are a lot of Palestinians who have invoked Gandhi and King, and many of them are in jail, and many of them are dead. So we should be really clear that to blame Palestinians for not resisting appropriately is a kind of dangerous thing. Okay, so just to say that, but we don't have to agree, but that would be how I feel about that. And obviously, there's a lot of tragedy in history. The way that it looks to me is that Palestinians were the people living in historic Palestine. There were Christians, there were Jews, there were Muslims. There were, at the beginning of in the middle of the Ottoman Empire, it was about 3% Jewish, 7% Jewish, and gradually Jewish migration increased. But the Muslim population was always the majority. And the Jews that lived there, that have lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years, actually called themselves Palestinians and spoke Arabic. So it's messy to use these kinds of words. I do think that when you look at the history of the Zionist movement, that the decision to have a Jewish state somewhere, and they were like, Uganda, Latin America, where should we put this place? And then they settled on historic Palestine because of the biblical connections, even though these were very secular Jews, is a history that was mirroring British colonialism. And so they were in that sort of school of thought, that it is okay to go to some place and decide that you're going to live there, and not to live with the people who are living there, but to throw them out and to make it your own. And that plan is highly problematic for the people who live there. And you could say, well, they should have resisted this way, or they should have resisted that way. We can't replay that history. But the history is the history that we got. But I can't blame them for resisting, Yeah, so again, obviously there's huge tragedy there. But settler colonialism is a huge tragedy as well.
It is, and there's and not meaning to dominate because I can talk to you while we're walking, but there are also Israeli historians who have come to the conclusion that the whole state aspect of Zionism was a late development, and that early on it was just a place of safety within the Ottoman Empire.
Right. I mean, there was a huge debate in the Jewish community about Zionism and whether it was a good idea, and would it destroy Judaism as a religion by having to have a state that spoke for the Jews, and is it okay to have Jewish privilege? And all of that stuff was debated. And the thing that I find really interesting is if you read the debates, it kind of predicts what happens. And what the people who were opposed to having a Jewish-only state, which was the goal, those people actually predicted what we're seeing now. So that's the tragedy of it, you know. So, you know, we got to learn from history. Yeah, we got to learn from history, yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you've seen in terms of language to describe things that happen to Palestinians and how they're treated? Because it's been difficult for me as a Palestinian to try and go to these news sources that I've trusted blindly for much of my life and see how they're describing what's happening. And it's not even close to reality as far as I'm concerned. So I'm curious what you think about that.
So, you know, so the question is, can I comment on the language that's used to describe Palestinians? Excuse me. So I do think that in the mainstream media, there is a lot of problems with the messaging about Palestinians and about Israel. And that the news media has an assumption that, and this is a big generalization, but it's largely true, that the Jewish Israelis are the good people who are not the violent people, who are the white people that we can sympathize with. And the Palestinians are the violent people that we have to, you know, worry about, and they're terrorists by definition. And even though that's kind of an extreme statement, that's kind of the underlying assumption. And you know, it's interesting because this group, We Are Not Numbers, that I work with, started after the 2014 war because a number of Palestinians were so upset that when you read the newspaper, you'd see, you know, Shlomo Ben Gavi, you know, was a soldier and he was injured and he has a wife and 4 children and he lives in the settlement. You hear a whole thing about this soldier, this Israeli soldier, and then you see, and 3,000 Palestinians died. So first of all, the Palestinians were anonymous, they're not named, and they died, they weren't killed. You know, in the language of the report, you see the prejudices of the reporter. And so I think that once you sort of see this, then you start reading the media in a very different way. And I'll give you an example of something that's incredibly controversial, so I'm just going to jump in. There was a report that immediately came out after the horrific Hamas attack of mass rape and of women's bellies being sliced open and newborn, you know, infants being killed, and just barbaric, horrific stuff. And this was reported like fact. And the accusation of mass rape is incredibly serious. And when you have that accusation, you need to have very, very careful documentation, investigation, outside groups looking at it, not the people who are reporting it, because it's a very major human rights violation, and it's also just horrifically horrific. And and the New York Times jumped on this and had, I don't know if you remember the woman in the black dress as the rape victim of choice. And they reported this just as the Israelis had promoted it. And then it turns out that the family of the woman with the black dress said, no, she was not raped. She just wasn't. We were talking to her on the phone right before she was killed, and she was not raped. And then it turned out that if you actually start looking at where they got their information, it was from this Israeli group that has this, I can't imagine doing this job, they collect the bodies of people after horrific suicide bombing and that kind of thing. And these guys have no qualifications to decide or understand if someone is raped or not. And it turned out there were no babies that were beheaded and there were no women that were sliced open. That whole mythology that these men, these Palestinian terrorists were just hypersexualized, violent beasts, was part of Israeli propaganda. And the thing that gives me a tremendous pause is that in our own country, that's how African American men are treated. You know, when men were hung up on trees, you know, they were being accused of looking at a white woman, and you know how, you know, hypersexualized black men are, and they're going to rape all our white women. It's how men, particularly men of color, are demonized. And to see that pattern again and again in our media in 2021, like, we should be better than that. So you see that kind of stuff a lot. And it was so interesting because the UN came out and said, you know, there may have been rapes, but we really need a further investigation. But they used the data from the Israelis who created the propaganda, we need independent investigations to figure out what happened and to call, to punish the people who did this. But I don't even think it happened. I mean, clearly horrific things happened, but mass rape I don't think it happened, because that was sort of an invented propaganda. Now, if it happened, we need to know, and people need to be held accountable. But that's how our newspapers, created this frenzy about terrorists. And it's just, the language can be really difficult to parse, but it's really our responsibility to not only look at the mainstream media and definitely not look at Fox News, but to look at Al Jazeera, look at Mondoweiss, go a little, look at the UN reports and see what they're saying. I think you get a much more accurate, more even idea of what's actually happened on the ground. Yes.
And for the CIA to allow the President of the United States
Yes.
to repeat that's the sentence. Because when the President says something, I believe. And that's a bankrupt.
So what he's saying is that for the CIA, or whoever allowed him, because who knows, that Biden repeated that lie is disgraceful. It's just
It's never been
disgraceful.
taken back. And let's even say that against all of our intuitions, if it were true, what it's doing is it's essentially fueling this incredible thing that from your upbringing is the Holocaust. It's the worst way to gather people's worst fears and instincts in order to be able to justify anything. And so if it were true, it would have been orchestrated, because the Palestinian people, and how out of character that would be. Right?
Right.
So if it were true, it would be orchestrated precisely to manipulate the Israeli public.
So what he's saying is that if it were true, this would have been orchestrated to manipulate the Israeli public. And you touch on something I think is very important, which is the abuse of the Holocaust. So if you look at the language that comes out of the Jewish community here and the Israeli community, Jewish Israeli community there, to evoke the Holocaust, which is a horrific moment in history, that killed 6 million Jews, along with a lot of other people that have totally been forgotten because this has become, only the Jewish trauma, is to trigger people in their most existential way. And so, the Israelis were saying this is the second worst thing compared to the Holocaust. Immediately the Holocaust was brought up, and you see the Holocaust being brought up over and over again to get people revved up and frightened. And so there is a whole, we actually call it the Holocaust industry, that uses this. And it's very, very dangerous. The other thing is that there is incredibly well-documented evidence from multiple organizations that Palestinians, particularly under interrogation and in Israeli jails, are tortured, are sexually tortured, there are a host of doctors that are respectable doctors in Gaza who, when the Israelis invaded their hospitals, they arrested them all, they stripped them to their underwear, they interrogated them almost naked, they made them walk through cold weather without any clothes on, and they took them to prison. This actually happened. Now, why isn't the press so upset about that? Because it doesn't fit the mythology. With the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, the most moral army in the world, they would never do that. Well, they do that. So, this is a problem in how we understand things. And so our media tends to reinforce our preconceptions. And part of this is because there is there's a whole messaging industry that comes out of Israel and in the US that's partly, AIPAC and Jewish organizations, partly Christian Zionist organizations that are devoted to shaping the message on Israel. And they really have a tremendous amount of control. And so we see that in our media. So maybe one more question, and then and then you'll all buy the few books that are left.
I don't really have a question, but I'd just like to say what a gift it's been to have you here. And it's been so informative and helpful, and we really appreciate it.
Great. Well, I hope that you think a lot about what I said and that you look at media in a different way. And if you want to know what's going on in health and human rights, I curate a weekly report that's on the Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council website, jvphealth.org. All my talks and writings are on my website, alicerothchild.com. And for the kids' books, I have a special website, alicerothchildbooks.com, where I have not only information about the books, but I have resources. I have a study guide for teachers. I have the toolkit. I'm trying to help educate the public and elevate the voices of Palestinians and Israeli peacemakers. So thank you so much.
Sincere thank you for Dr. Rothschild for being here today. She covered a lot of this, but Eric and I have purchased some of her books. Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, and Condition Critical are available in our lending library, which is on this ledge over here because we didn't have enough tables. So those are books for borrow, and just give them back to us when you're done. There's a collection of other books, including a Palestinian cookbook, which is another way of resistance, right? eating our food, it's good. You can contact us anytime you want to borrow a book. And then, please listen to her oral history documentary on Palestine and Israel, Voices Across the Divide. It's voicesacrossthedivide.com.
It's on Vimeo.
She has spoken some other places in Atlanta this week. I'll work on getting those videos and sharing them with this group. And of course, this is being recorded as well, so I'll share this with this group afterwards. But thank you all for being here today. I know we're a little bit over time. Thank you for starting the morning with us and for coming here with an open heart. We appreciate you.
Thank you.